Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for your arrival. It's wonderful to see all these forum participants for our second meeting, which is being co-hosted with HJ International Graduate School. And we're very happy to have part two of our Economic Democracy series tonight with our speaker, Alan Jessen. I think what we'll do is we'll begin as we'd like to bring God into our presence with an opening prayer. And let's see if I can find the right I'm looking for Friederike Busick. We were together a couple weekends ago, right, in Gloucester. Are you in the mood to offer an opening prayer?
Good evening. Yes.
Please.
I shall. Good evening, our most loving Heavenly Parent, God. When you look on this world, your heart is reaching out. Thank you for bringing us all together tonight to discuss this very important topic for a world of mutual prosperity, interdependence, and universally shared values. May your presence fill the hearts and minds of our speakers and enlighten us so we can see your vision for the future of humankind, to truly create a world of peace and equity. We invite your heavenly presence for each one of us, and we pray together in gratitude. I pray this in the names of all assembled. Amen.
Amen. Oh, that was a beautiful, beautiful start. Thank you, Friederike. Your recognition of what an important subject this is. And I'm really grateful for our brave economic pioneer, Alan, who's offering to prepare this series for us. We're really happy to have that series included in our forum. And I'd like to introduce, to start the forum this evening, the Dean of HJ International Graduate School, Dean Stephen Boyd.
Thank you very much, Jim. It's a pleasure to be here tonight, co-hosting with the Higher Purpose Forum, HJ International, joining together with your team and all of our invited. As Jim said, my name is Stephen Boyd. I'm the Dean of Enrollment Management and Student Life at HJ International. It's my pleasure to welcome you tonight and to thank you for coming. It's our pleasure to offer, as a graduate school, a number of degree programs that we hope some of you might find interest in. And so I'm just going to take a brief moment here to talk to you just briefly about the programs that we have to offer. And to do that, I'll share my screen. So here at HJ International, we have 4 degree programs and a certificate in leadership, a Master of Arts in Religious Studies, a Master of Arts in Peace Studies, which I think might be of interest to many of you on the program today, a Master of Divinity, and a Doctor of Ministry. So I'd like to invite you or your friends, anyone that you know who might be interested in taking a class or entering a degree program, to take what we call the HJI Challenge. Many of you I know are a longtime unificationists. We have people on the call of various faiths. But what we have found is that Oftentimes, when someone takes the venture to study, take even one course or two courses online from the comfort of your home, you enter a world that maybe was unknown to you and which you find very stimulating. So we would like to invite you, if you have any inclination at all, to consider this possibility. I know this is what I did because I came to work at HJI a little over 3 years ago, almost 3.5 years ago, and under the guidance of particularly of Dr. Thomas Ward, who was president of HJI at that time, I decided to take the plunge after many years of having already completed my graduate degree. What I discovered is an engaging classroom, very bright and inspiring students, a highly qualified faculty, a classroom that's composed both of, for the unificationists that attend, both first and second generation unificationists, and members of various faith traditions, both Christian and members of other religions. It's a very dynamic, very interesting, very intriguing atmosphere that I found very stimulating. And I think some of you on the call are already studying with us. What I found stimulated me so much that I've actually entered the Doctor of Ministry degree program. So I'm very, very pleased to welcome you and speak from my own experience of the valuable experience that an education, even one or two courses at HJI can offer to you. So there are scholarships available. Also, I know that cost is always a concern, but we have very generous scholarships that we offer to our students. And I will put my contact information and some important links into the chat box during the program. But if you're interested enough to study with us and you'd like to apply, we'll be very happy to waive normally our $30 application fee for each of those that may be interested tonight to study. This is my contact information, but I'll drop that into the chat box later in the program. So thank you very much, Jim, for the opportunity to share a little bit about HJI. And I encourage you, if you have any questions, to please reach out to me or others who are here at HJI. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Stephen. Very good. All right. So here's our agenda for today. Whoop. Okay. Is that visible, my PowerPoint there?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you, Dean Boyd. I myself am a student at HJI, I'm proud to say, and I'm learning a lot, that's to say the least. After I give this brief introduction, we'll hear our presentation from Alan Jessen, today's talk, which is Economic Democracy, Part 2, Mutual Prosperity Through the Distribution of Ownership. And then our respondent today is Don Brohan, who's actually one of the co-founders of the organization where Alan studied this idea of mutual prosperity through the distribution of ownership, CESJ, Center for Economic and Social Justice, which was founded in the 80s. And Don is part of the faculty of their educational program. And then after that, we'll have a very important part of our program, which is our participant discussion. We try to have at least 25 minutes of discussion. And I will tell you in many of our meetings, that's the best part of the meeting. We take that discussion period very seriously. And then once we get to the end of our time, I'll invite Dr. Ward, who's the dean and the provost at HJI Graduate School, to offer his closing comments. I'll just quickly go through the purpose of Higher Purpose Forum. Higher Purpose Forum, or HPF, is a 501c3 organization formed in 2019 as an independent educational project of unificationism. Based on the ideas of unificationism, the Higher Purpose Forum explores and disseminates new, future-facing, God-centered understanding in addressing challenging contemporary issues. The issue we're discussing tonight is wealth distribution. We seek solutions that advance shared values, mutual prosperity, and interdependence. And this perspective and method, sometimes referred to as headwing, I guess that's the colloquial term, is guided by the teachings of Reverend Moon and his wife, Dr. Hak Ja Han Moon. And the areas that we've been developing over the last 4 years are primarily in the area of American history, American Providential History and Race. I've been leading that, developing that with Reverend Zachary Oliver. And we teach that now in seminars. I'm teaching it this week, actually, in my neighborhood. We've had a series on the contemporary distortion of our times and the Great Awakening. We're supporting Alan's development of a series on economic democracy. And we've had a series on principled foreign policy, which we hope to somehow develop into a sort of a systematic offering. The ground rules of today's meeting, please be respectful that today's participants represent a range of faiths and perspectives. We're not all unificationists, so let's make sure that everyone feels comfortable, feels included. Our participant discussion period is an important part of this program. We encourage you to participate, to prepare yourself to contribute to the conversation once our speakers are finished. Please keep something in mind. And then if you'd like to speak, please use the Zoom function to raise your hand so we can then call on you. However, if you prefer to comment in writing, please just send your email message to me, Jim Edgerly, at higherpurposeforum.org. This meeting is being recorded, and we will end no later than 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'd just like to quickly read a summary of Alan Jesson's biography. Alan has 34 years of experience in small business management and ownership. He served for 9 years in the government and nonprofit sectors as the Economic Development Director for the Iowa Northland Regional Council and Government, and as the Executive Director of Silos and Smokestacks, a federally funded national heritage area in Waterloo, Iowa. Alan is a part-time financial professional and currently the North American coordinator for the International Association for Peace and Economic Development, IAED, which is one of the 8 associations under the umbrella of the Universal Peace Federation, UPF. Alan has a BS degree in economics from Grinnell College in Iowa, and he is a graduate of the 10-week Justice University course at the Center for Economic and Social Justice, in which he studied the ideas of Louis Kelso. Those are the ideas we'll be discussing this evening. And just so I can introduce her for later in the program, before Alan speaks, I quickly want to give Dawn the respondent's biography. Dawn is a co-founder and is now the executive committee member and director of communications of the Center for Economic and Social Justice, which was established in 1984. She has co-authored 2 books with CESJ's Director of Research, Michael Graney, Economic Personalism, 2020, and The Greater Reset in 2022. She is also co-authored with Norman Kurland, her father, and Michael Graney, Capital Homesteading for Every Citizen in 2005. Dawn edited Every Worker and Owner, the orientation book for President Ronald Reagan's 1986 Presidential Task Force on Economic Justice. And with that introduction, I'm very happy and very excited to introduce our tonight's speaker, Alan Jesson.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Greetings, everyone. Appreciate Jim. He's a great cheerleader and supporter. So I'm going to share my screen, I guess, and make sure you can do that. And slideshow. Here we go. Okay, so I want to give my thanks to my teachers, of course, Dawn Brohan, who's here, and her father, Norm Kurland, and Michael Graney. I've had, I'm not the expert. I'm just a student myself. And so I should probably mention these are my views, not the views of the IAED program. I've been kind of launched into this 12 years ago. I've spoken with Dr. Gordon Anderson many times, and we've had good discussions. So I hope my voice holds out. Sometimes it doesn't, gets a little weak. But anyway, that's, we're going to go through here. I'm the messenger, not the message. but I'm really happy to share with you all. So I'm going to keep it real simple on this number 2 sharing, but I'm going to really propose that economic democracy as a principal and useful term for directing our inquiries into the search for economic systems that can deliver mutual prosperity, as we've talked about, is I think, a very powerful term that we should adopt. And then I want to make a case, really, that we need a new paradigm, because the current economic systems are flawed. And if we're going to guide the future, we need to base it on solid ground. And I believe, as Dr. Anderson shared a couple weeks ago, in this evolution of the economic sphere, I hope to encourage people to consider this paradigm, taught by or uncovered by Louis Kelso. And I believe it aligns with unification thought concepts and objectives. And I thought I would start with this because, and there's my goal, to just advance the conversation for further study and probably collective study too, Jim, not just, myself, but anybody who's interested, we could, work together. But I'm getting the screen out of my way here. There we go. So in 2021, we actually heard from Norman Kurland and Dr. Robert Ashford, who spoke at our summit in Seoul, Korea. And I want to share just this real quick thing from Dr. Ashford. He says, where is it? Okay. Binary economics is an idea that is neither right wing nor left wing, nor a mix of the two. Rather, binary economics is a new system of private property, and economics. Based on the work of Louis Kelso, binary economics can be described as a paradigm because 1, it rests on reasonable assumptions, and 2, it is internally consistent, and 3, which is very important, it offers both a good descriptive and prescriptive model. So it can describe our current world affairs, and I think we can all see the world we live in has some challenges with concentration of capital, for example, and also a prescriptive model, ways we can build from that theory to find useful policies and how to fix that problem. So, but it does have to be understood on its own terms, and that's important. So I want to begin, of course, with Reverend Moon's revelatory book written in 1957, The Divine Principle, where he takes a macro view of God's providence and building of an ideal world that God desires and that every human heart longs for. He said, the paths of religion, politics, and economy to converge and realize God's ideal, a new expression of truth must emerge, which can completely integrate religion and science. The religion and universal values founded upon this truth will lead all humanity to become one with God in heart. Such people then will build an economy in accordance with the divine ideal. These will be the foundations for a new political order which can realize the ideal of creation. This will be the messianic kingdom, the ideal world built on the principles of interdependence, mutual prosperity, and universal values. And I find the order here is so important because, of course, we all, I think, understand that no true ideal is going to emerge without people really having a transformation of heart. We're becoming brothers and sisters, one nation, one world under God, that kind of thing. But then people want to jump to the political side and take power and give me the power and I will authorize a system that everybody will love, right? But it doesn't work that way. So I think Reverend Moon's insight here is very critical. If we address the economy, work on that, it's the proper order. And he says the democracies of two types arose with the purpose of dismantling absolute monarchy, transferring sovereignty to the people in order to demolish economic systems which concentrated society's wealth in the hands of a privileged few. Each of these movements sought to establish a system which would distribute wealth more equally among people. Because people, human beings, are created to live in an ideal society. That's in our heart. Therefore, we inevitably pursue a kind of socialistic ideal, a brotherhood, as we strive for freedom, and then a society based on a truly democratic economic system. That's one reason I believe this term economic democracy is so powerful for our work. So where do we look for this future economic system? Well, I'm studying with Dr. Ward at the class on unification worldview, and he told us this story. We're studying the unification thought critique and counter proposal to Marxist theories. And this Cowles manual was developed to do exactly that. We taught all across South America and North America. But Dr. Ward said that they brought the book to meeting with Reverend Moon. And after his review, he's with about 5 or 6 other students. He said, I've read it in Korean and English. And there's one thing I want to change is the word socialism with market economy as the future economic system. I think that's so important to realize that's really where we want to be. And why is that? He said, because first, democracy came in the religious sphere to give voice to people for religious matters, and then in the political sphere to give them the vote, freedom to express their political voice. In the economic sphere, it's the market economic system that's giving people the freedom to express their economic voice. And I think as we understand more, we want to perfect that system. So I shared last time that I had studied this book from the Professor World Peace Academy. There's 6 essays on economics. You'll notice that one of them has a heading of economic democratization. And their hope is that unification thought can find this theoretical basis for presenting a fresh discourse on modern economic theory. So that's really, we're still searching and building that, and I hope to add through that. But in that book, they also recognize that the problem of unification thought's economic theory of the principle of interdependence at this point is that it has failed to progress into realistic economic discourse, only remains on the level of an idealistic discourse. As such, it cannot present insights into aspects of the real economy like real estate, macro and microeconomic policy, finance, exchange rate, monopoly prevention policy. So we're searching for those technical aspects, and I believe that this binary theory can help give us in that direction. Just a reminder, there's 2 core concepts throughout: ownership and distribution, which turn up again and again as part of our search for core concepts and answers. Okay, then again, a reminder that economics is not a value-free discipline. It's born out of political economy, deals with human behavior and human relationships. So it's a humane science. And therefore, it really needs to involve the concept of justice, and specifically economic and social justice, if we are to find this roadmap for the future and an economic theory. In the previous presentation 2 weeks ago, Gordon Anderson did touch on this. He mentioned that we live currently with an unjust capitalism where monopolies are not checked, where concentration of capital ownership is allowing the buying up of housing, property, and businesses that erode individual economic sovereignty and threaten the general welfare. He alluded to the need for a just capitalism, and he put a lot of emphasis on the corruption involved in the money and banking systems that are being used for private gains. And then Dr. Walsh, who's the president of HJI, expressed his serious concerns for this issue of inequality and how it creates jealousies and resentment. So hopefully we're on the path to provide some insight. So why do we need a new paradigm? Well, since the birth of modern theories on the economy in the 1800s, and this is rough, but I believe there are basically 3 central branches that have been guiding governments in their economic and political policies. And of course, despite great achievements we've seen in the economic development, lifting millions of people out of poverty, our contention really is that none of these 3 theories, for differing reasons, are capable in practice of bringing the world to a higher place of justice, of peace, and the realization of our full human potential. So briefly, these are one, and this was early on in the industrialization period. Adam Smith kind of founded really the free market theory, and I would include neoclassical since him and Austrian economists. Karl Marx's theories, of course, which have led us to socialism and communism. And then John Maynard Keynes came along in 1937, at the time of the Great Depression. So let's dig in a little bit. Adam Smith, with The Wealth of Nations, argued against mercantilism and the struggle between nations using their economic power to amass wealth. He proposed the idea of laissez-faire. Governments should allow the markets to regulate themselves and bring prosperity based on competition, supply and demand, and self-interest with the goal of achieving equilibrium, which is the kind of the nirvana of economics. Let's reach that equilibrium point. Dr. Ward cautioned us, and I thought this was very good, because we brought this up in class, that Adam Smith was not just talking about self-interest, but in his other book, Moral Sentiments, he spoke of the conscience within that is not just seeking for its own self-benefit, but truly for ways in which the distribution of wealth can be beneficial to all of mankind, but not through the government, but through the heart. So let's hang on to that concept. And then Karl Marx wrote his works in Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital as a critique of the free market theory in his quest, really, for economic justice. As funny as it is, looking back, but it turned the word of capitalism into a negative that remains today. He took the existing classical theory of labor theory of value, which says that all value is connected to labor. He turned that into a materialistic theory and developed his theory of surplus value, which became the linchpin of the revolutionary argument. And under this theory, surplus value, which is really the profit of production, above the cost of labor, raw materials, and depreciated capital, was stolen by the capitalist owners from the laboring classes, who, under the theory of labor theory of value, were the rightful owners of that surplus. And this awful theory has had a devastating legacy of resentment and justification for murder. Interestingly, we find this from Investopedia, while Marxism and Marxian economics have been largely rejected by the mainstream today, many of Marx's critiques of capitalism remain relevant today. So what are those? To me, I believe that it's Marx's first law of economic movement, which discussed the concentration of capital. And of course, that remains, I think, the core of resentment that we see in the world today. And it does block the free market system from realizing its full potential to provide economic security for all. So we need to deal with Jean-Baptiste Say and the Say's laws of markets. If we're going to really understand, we need to have a look at this. So I'll give a short dive into it, but supply, the law says that supply creates its own demand. So again, from a macro perspective, Say's law implies that production, which is the supply side, is the key to economic growth and prosperity, and that government policy should encourage production rather than focus on consumption. It's the fundamental logic underpinning the ideal of the private property free market economy, a self-regulating process that would allow the markets to automatically correct its periodic imbalances and realize a point of equilibrium, which they understood to be synonymous with full employment. And that remains the goal today, really. Objective of economic policy, you can read it in the newspapers, is full employment. How can we reach full employment? So Say's law of market describes an economic system where productive input on one side into the production process, measured in costs, translates then into a distributive outtake on the other, measured in earnings. So it's kind of an accounting system writ large in the macro system. So that's the law, and that was guiding most of economics, and it was the linchpin of the classical theory until the Great Depression, when we had another person come on the scene to try to clear this up and and save the system, some argue. But John Maynard Keynes argued that his general theory overcame the classical thinking by abandoning its attachment to Say's law, which was the presumption that price always efficiently links supply and demand. Under his macroeconomic theories, the demand side came to preoccupy bureaucrats and economists in their work to manage the economy. He had this idea of aggregate demand. So therefore, he really flipped the theory around and said demand then creates its own supply. And that's why you have government policies really thinking that if they just create money and send money out, it will generate production and therefore keep the economy out of recession, things like that. Now, Paul Samuelson, I took this from foreignpolicy.com recently. There's been a lot of writing about Keynes because his legacy is on the ascendancy, really, after the crisis of 2008, some of the problems we've had in the world. So Samuelson put it this way. He says, with the skillful use of the two, fiscal and monetary tools, we can have a managed economy that behaves like a neoclassical model. In other words, we can and indeed must use regulatory tools to realize the high growth capitalist economy that the classicals said markets would produce if left to themselves. So this is the Keynesian economics that cemented the economic foundation for the welfare state, and it remains at the heart of modern economics. I just wanted to put a point on that emphasis there, where the welfare state comes from, really. So let's dig now into a little bit of Louis Kelso. Okay, he's he wrote the Capitalist Manifesto in 1958, and also the New Capitalists, a proposal to free economic growth from the slavery of savings, 1961. Now, I emphasize that slavery of savings because I'm not going to touch on that concept, but it's very important to understanding how our finance system needs to make some changes if we're to move forward. But he was a corporate attorney, investment banker. He had intimate knowledge of corporate form of organization. He wrote legislation, but he understood corporate finance, and he understood the way finance worked to benefit the few at the expense of the many, really. And Mortimer Adler was an American philosopher, educator, and encyclopedist. And I thought this comment was interesting. He was a brilliant man, but he said when he encountered Kelso's work, he said, it's the first clear and systematic statement of the idea of capitalism that has ever been presented to the world. Wow, that's high praise. But so Say's law holds the key to perfecting the free market system, right? Say's law holds the key. Now, why is that? Well, I got to click. Let's take a look at the theory itself. So binary theory states that there are two factors of production, two inputs. Human labor in all its forms, physical, intellectual, entrepreneurial. Capital, all non-human inputs, not money. I'm not talking about money. I'm talking about non-human inputs into the production process, land materials, equipment, software, things like that. So there's just two factors. And the cause of the breakdown in Say's law of markets that sent us in the Great Depression and sent us down a different road, really, according to Kelso's binary theory, is that capital has not been recognized as earning income, only labor. Okay? So traditional theory says that capital makes labor more productive and therefore wages should go up, right? Wages should go up because they're being more productive. But in truth, technological change has made capital more productive. Thus, the market source increases of the productive gains that are to be distributed has not gone to those who work with capital, but those who own capital. Very important. This graph, I think, illustrates what the traditional theories talk about, that there's a gap between real wages and what labor should be paid. Because if you have labor productivity going up here, why aren't wages going up along with it? Well, under the labor theory, that'd be true. But then if a McDonald's worker earns $30 an hour, what would the cost of a hamburger be, right? Where do we keep going up and up? So anyway, that's where traditional economics is, but there is a problem. Definitely there's a problem. So again, how do we, Say's law holds the key. So the systemic problem, therefore, is not the maldistribution of income, according to Kelso, but a deeper cause, the maldistribution of the productive power of capital. Say's law, in its holistic form, assumes a democratic distribution of the production of inputs, the supply side, to balance the democratic consumption. Okay. So, well, the practical implication is simple. It says, we cannot efficiently produce goods and services through two factors, labor and capital, while we distribute income through just one. Free market logic will not permit it. You'll have an imbalance which needs to be filled. How is that imbalance filled? Government spending, consumer credit, usury, all kinds of things, but not a real balance based on supply and demand and income power. So we have the realization here that in the absence of a functioning mechanism capable of applying this internal economic distributive principle, without that, then the only recourse, as we've seen, has been a political redistribution of income to keep some sort of economic balance. This is Keynesianism in the world we live in today. So is that not true? If we're not distributing it through the economic system, then the political system jumps in and they feel they need to do it out of fairness and moral principles, and also out of keeping the economy from burning and crashing, right, and breaking apart. So those are the choices we really have. And then universal basic income, which is being talked a lot about, is really coming from that same angle of political redistribution, the logical outcome of the welfare state, and theories that are not theories, but a push for ideas such as stakeholder capitalism and other views that involve big government. I just want to then touch on this and make sure that our audience understands that Kelso's contributions and legacy are not just theoretical and pie in the sky, but they're real. They were real. And even though it's been years, these were real and substantial contributions. So, number one, they created the employee stock ownership legislation that passed Congress and exists today. And there's hundreds of thousands of employee stock ownership companies around the world. And Senator Wrong, as you can read on the floor of the Senate, 1983, said, ownership goes to the heart of what an economic system we mean to have. And it's not a partisan issue, but brings out the best of our free market system, free enterprise system. And the goal is not to redistribute wealth of current owners. We're not for taxing and giving here, but we want to provide incentives for the financing to be restructured so that more Americans will have a chance to accumulate a capital estate. Also, they had a big impact with congressional leaders in the 1976 Joint Economic Committee report. And look at this red summary here. The committee recommends the adoption of a national policy to foster the goal of broadened capital ownership. And if you look in the yellow, it says, meanwhile, new capital, and this is important, the new capital assets that are coming on every year, new capital generated by businesses, which in recent years have averaged well over 100 billion and now in the trillions, but they redound largely to the benefit of these persons who already have great wealth. That's the engine that concentrates capital. They recognize that as a problem. They say to begin to diffuse the capital ownership of capital to provide an opportunity for citizens of moderate incomes to become owners of capital, rather than relying solely on their labor as a source of income and security. Okay, that's a big, important part. Then they recommend the adoption of a national policy. Let's revive that. Let's talk to our leaders and see if we can get that back on the table. And then also, similarly, at that time, Hubert Humphrey was a senator wrote this article in the Washington Post. He said, I also recognize that capital and the question of who owns it and therefore reaps the benefits of its productiveness is an extremely important issue, and it'd be a twin pillar along with full employment. I mentioned Ronald Reagan, Norm Kurland, and thank God Norm Kurland is still with us today at 93, still going strong, or 91, Norm. I don't want to give you too many years yet. But anyway, he was on this task force where they said they endorsed the expanded capital ownership as a means for achieving economic democracy, as a foundation for sustaining a political democracy. And that's another important point. But I want to really added this to this, because this is a very, very important concept. So Walter Reuther was head of the United Auto Workers. He had met Kelso and Kurland, loved their ideas, embraced them, and he spoke about this at a joint committee of 1967. Of course, fortunately, he died shortly thereafter, but he says, profit sharing in the form of stock distribution to workers would help to democratize the ownership of America's vast corporate wealth, which is today appallingly undemocratic and unhealthy. And we can add the world for that matter. If workers had definite assurance of equitable shares in the profits of the corporations that employ them, they would see less need to seek augmented increases in basic wages. And this would be a desirable result from the standpoint of stabilization policy, because profit sharing does not increase costs. Since profits are residual, after all costs have been met, profit sharing through wider share of ownership cannot be said to have any inflationary impact on costs and prices. I think this is really a key insight into creating a more stable situation than sharing the wealth, of course. Okay, I want to kind of try to wrap things up and let you hear from Norm Kurland himself a little bit when he spoke at the 2001 Summit Council for World Peace in Korea. So this is some of his words from his talk about the new paradigm. He says, as Pope Paul VI said, if you want peace, work for justice. In our work to bring about a more peaceful world, we can be guided by a clear understanding of the principles of economic and social justice. The act of social justice is when we recognize a problem in our institutions, develop a plan for change, and come together to change the social order. It's not about outcome, it's about changing the order. Since capital can be defined as things, capitalism represents a value system that glorifies things. On the other hand, socialism is based on the vice of envy, seeks to pull down the other person, impose forced equality of results. We have to create our system so that people are valued above things, so they control things, so they can regain the sovereignty given them by God. It says, if we are to create a world in the third millennium that secures the sovereignty of the human person and economic empowerment of the family, we can see the need for a third alternative to the two present paradigms. Logically, a third way would be a free market system that economically empowers all individuals and families through direct and effective ownership of the means of production. This would be the best check against the potential for corruption and abuse, either a state ownership of production or majority of elites. And he says stable families require stable incomes. Concentration of wealth and power today threatens the stability, well-being, and income security of the family. So, how do we create the conditions to connect all people and families to the tremendous growth potential of the advanced technology and energy systems? Our economy is growing. It's going to grow more through incredible capital. How do we connect everybody to a share of that? The answer lies in the redesign of our credit and banking systems, which today channel money and credit to the small percentage of humanity who own most of today's productive capital. There's a lot of depth to dig in on that point, of course. So maybe that's next time, Jim. So binary economics recognize that economic process involves two sweeping categories of input, labor and capital, people and things. And since capital is what's making the vast difference in terms of growth, we have to make sure that ownership of capital is accessible to all of humanity. Not so that people pursue lives that are strictly materialistic, but so people can have sufficient material foundation for living rich spiritual lives. We should be using money and credit to develop people, not to exclude people. And even more critical than participation with a vote, Norm was saying, is participation in the economic process. This principle states that every person has the right to participate fully in the economic process, to own capital, with both their labor and their capital. It is a principle of equal opportunity, which includes access to the means of acquiring and possessing productive property. Okay, thank you all. I'm going to sum it up here a little bit. We spoke about the need for the transformation of heart. I believe and that's the internal aspect. And I believe unification thought, and there's others. Some of what I've studied a lot is Catholic social teaching. There's a lot of concepts of social justice in there that are very informative. But building a culture of heart, and the UT thought provides a number of examples of ownership, joint ownership and reasonable ownership that would really help improve our world economic system. But we need truth in economics. We need truth in economics. As we've talked about, capital makes capital more productive, not labor. This is a big change. Calling for a just wage or a living wage is a moral argument, certainly understandable, but it's not a true economic one. The answer lies on the capital side, giving access to capital ownership. And how new capital economic growth is financed is also the key to understanding how capital concentrates, how it can be fixed and changed, and reforms to the banking credit systems are required. The Kelso theory talks a lot about past savings and future savings and how that benefits the wealthy because they have collateral, and the many don't really have collateral, so they can't access credit. So it needs to be unpacked. So economic democracy, to me, is, as I've mentioned, is what I feel is we should align with. It's a great term. I've been studying this. The term has been around for 100 years with different economists writing about it, but it's open to being really claimed and developed. What's pushing a lot of the world on the more secular, progressive vision is stakeholder capitalism, the World Economic Forum, but they're not really presenting anything in the Great Reset, they call it. They're not really speaking about economic democracy, one that is aligned with natural law and human sovereignty. And the key to this really is that's why I wanted to touch on this Say's law to help understand that there's been a breakdown in the free market system that needs correction. And also this, I think, can resolve the central complaint that Marx has for capital concentration. I want to thank you for that. Let's see if I have any. Jim, I guess I'm completing my remarks here. So I'm turning over to Dawn to give a great commentary and fill in the blanks where I might have skipped.
Thank you, Alan. Very much. It's great to hear a very condensed version of a lot of complicated economics. You did a great job. And we're so happy to have Dawn with us, the daughter of Norm Kurland and also a co-founder of CESJ. Thank you, Dawn, for being our respondent. We'd love to hear from you.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Alan, for a superb and very substantial presentation on the idea of economic democracy. And I want to start with a simple proposition that you can have democracy without justice, but you can't have justice without democracy. And when we talk about democracy, we're looking at it not in terms of in collective terms, but really in terms of getting power to each human being. and how you create a social order and institutions within that social order, which channels power to each person, and how we avoid monopolies and how we avoid the concentration of power, which leads inevitably to corruption. So Louis Kelso's ideas, as Alan was pointing out, he co-authored the Capitalist Manifesto with the philosopher Mortimer Adler. And here you had really, I think, a unique blending of free market concepts and principles with concepts of justice, and specifically economic justice. And Kelso's paradigm, and I have to say, it's a paradigm that melds very well with other thought. And Alan had mentioned some of the social encyclicals that delve very deeply into the idea of what is social justice. And we want to clarify that this is not a collectivist concept of democracy. It's not a collectivist idea of the economy, but we really have to look at how each person can interact in the economy in order to meet his, her basic human needs, material needs, so that they can go on to higher forms of work. So Kelso and Adler were looking in terms of the future of a society, Athens without slaves. And this, they saw, could come about when technology, automation, robotics, etc., could take over much of the economic toil that people had to spend their lives at, with a few people benefiting from owning other people so that they could engage in the work of civilization. So the question is, how do you achieve this? And I think to understand Alan's concept of economic democracy, which is, it's essentially based on the principles of economic justice, that you should be rewarded based on your contributions. So we differentiate justice from charity, which is to give without expectation of return, and it's done purely for the love and concern for the other. Justice is, though, a concept of equal exchange. And in terms of economics, what Kelso saw was that if you look at how people contribute, how they participate, mainly from a labor-centered approach, that all value is created by labor, then by injustice, by the principles of justice, that's where the distributed output should flow, is to those contributing labor. But what was clear to Marx even was that he saw that technology was replacing the need for much of human labor. Now, he had to justify this within he borrowed from David Ricardo's labor theory of value, but by not recognizing that people could, in addition to owning their own labor and getting a market-based wage, they could also contribute to the economy, the productive process, through their ownership of capital. So what Kelso saw as a corporate finance attorney is he saw how the wealthy could use other people's money to increase their ownership of capital. And then he noticed another phenomenon, is that there's a certain limit to how much human beings can consume. And he gave an example of one of the richest people in the world giving a party. This was back in the early 1900s. And during the period of time that the party was occurring, that wealthy person had continued to earn money. In fact, it gets to the point where you can't even spend the income you're generating. So Kelso observed that this is where, what do you do then? Well, you reinvest, you purchase more capital. So this whole process of concentration of future capital ownership, it gets worse and worse. And then, as Alan mentioned, our system of finance, and here we have to look at even our understanding of money, needs to change so that it's not a commodity, it's not something that you amass just for the sake of amassing money, but it is really used as a social tool for the development of every human being, and first to address their economic needs and their economic freedom, their choice within a marketplace, but also allowing a marketplace to operate the way it's supposed to. And we have no free market system today. It's rife with lots of all sorts of government intervention. You have, for example, the understandable demands for a raising of wages, the minimum wage. It's understandable when people can't think of another way to generate their own income. They then turn to, well, we need to be paid more. And as Alan pointed out, Walter Reuther, the UAW president, saw that there was a better way for people to increase their incomes, and that was through ownership of capital, in which the owner would get by right the profits of the capital that that person owns. So property is a very important aspect of economic democracy, as Alan was pointing out, and that is simply the right of the owner to the full fruits of what their capital produces, as well as control over what you own. And if you don't have that, you will never have economic democracy. And if you don't have economic democracy, we can see the results today. You do not have a true functioning political democracy. And the key, and I'm going to end on this one statement, is, and this is something Alan knows, my father, Norm Kurland, he always reminds me to keep in mind that it's money is the critical institution, understanding it shouldn't be viewed as a commodity, but as just a way of measuring value in all market exchanges, and that it can be, in a very businesslike way, be created in such a way that the needs of the private sector for growth can be met, while simultaneously opening up equal opportunity to every person from the day they're born to the day they die. They can become part of this flow of money needed to grow the economy. So I'll end it on that statement.
Thank you, Don.
Thank you.
Well, for those in our group who haven't studied economics, this might have been a very challenging presentation. And I know that there are people in the audience also wondering, well, how does the rubber meet the road? How do you actually distribute ownership without taking ownership away from the existing owners? And I think, Alan, what we have to say is that would likely be the subject for part 3. Am I right?
Yes,
Absolutely.
It'll take some unpacking. That's true. I touched on it a little bit last time, but
yeah. But I think you will explain that it's a matter of changing the way that the financial system works.
Almost every critique, that's where you end up. The money system, not the money, but the financing system and the credit system. Of course, we've had lots of reforms, against redlining and other things to make it more accessible. So we're always trying to do that, but in a large scope way is what this is all about, a systemic kind of change, because we know that's really needed. We have cooperatives, we have different forms of business structures that spread the wealth, and that's all good. We want to pursue that, but in a structural way to eliminate the natural concentration of capital. By the way, new capital necessary for the growth of the economy is being financed today by the past savings of the wealthy, and it can be done. I saw a question in the chat box. The big vision is to use the Federal Reserve Bank to issue capital credits. Okay, and that would then could be distributed and could finance new capital growth. That's why you're not taking away from existing people. We're not. although there are tax reforms is part of the overall big vision. So a tax reform is also part of it. But financing is the key.
And I just want to add something to what Alan said. I think people recognize that today, the way the Federal Reserve is operating is that it's creating money based on, it's backed by government debt. And now they're even starting to backing new money with securities, Wall Street securities, which is highly speculative. What our money system today is not based on is future production, things, the creation of real goods and services, the value of those. So there's as Alan was suggesting, there's a lot to unpack in terms of how the mechanism of commercial banks, the Federal Reserve, which is the central bank, or the regional Federal Reserves, insurance, all will come together. And this is something that I hope in the next presentation we can take people step by step of the process. And it's not so much that the Federal Reserve just issues credit. It really is responding to the capital growth needs of private businesses. The difference is that now through citizens, they'll have something equivalent to, and I'll explain, a trust, as with employee stock ownership plans, through which money can be channeled in order to purchase newly issued shares that would pay, essentially, as new products are sold, the profits pay for the loan that's taken out. So
John, I think we better wait till next time.
I agree, because it really can get complex. But
yes,
the idea is if you can have access to credit to purchase something that will create its own profits in the future, those profits can be used to pay off the original loan. And that's what employee stock ownership plans do for corporate employees. So without going too much into the detail.
I think what I'll do is I'll try to summarize this session and the last session in a little paper that I will send out to our Higher Purpose Forum and hopefully the HJI participants. And then we'll have a clear foundation for the first two sessions before we get into the kind of more complex issues of implementation. I think it is a little confusing because we're using the word capital, I think, even today in two different ways still. We're using it both to talk about everything in the production function other than labor, but we're also using it to talk about ownership, capital ownership. I think I think, at least for me, when I read those articles from the newspapers that you put up in 1976, I don't think they're using the word capital the way you're using the word capital.
Right. Could I just maybe comment on what you just said? The key difference is when Kelso and we use the word capital, we are speaking specifically about productive inputs that are not human beings, no human inputs. When we use ownership, we're really talking about property. What are the rights of ownership with regard to the capital? If you own the capital, then you are entitled to all the profits that your capital generates, and you have the right to control how your capital is used. So we don't equate ownership and capital. Capital is just something that you can own.
Okay, we'll be digging into that next time.
Okay.
So I see there's some very important issues coming up in our chat. I don't have the ability to keep an eye on the chat and involve myself in this conversation at the same time. So I'd be really grateful if those of you or anyone else who would like to join in our conversation, if you could raise your hands, and then I'm going to call on you. And let's see here. We got 87. Okay. Dr. Sullivan, thank you for being with us. We'll be happy to hear from you.
Yes, thank you very much. There's so much going on in this meeting. I guess my question is to both Alan and Dawn, and generally, is there an implicit assumption here that these ideas for economic democracy can be best or primarily or first applied in the United States? Does it depend on the United States to move in this direction before anybody else can? Or what about other countries? Are there perhaps other places in the world that are more amenable to these concepts than the United States? That's my question.
Okay.
Is everybody else waiting in line for some kind of transformation to happen in the United States first? That's my question.
Okay. Alan, I have an answer, but Alan, if you'd
No,
like
go
to.
ahead. Go ahead, Don. You speak first, sir.
In many respects, the United States would be the best place to start because of obviously the great influence it has over all nations in the world. However, this idea could be implemented in any country which would have access to a central bank and have access to technologies to be purchased. I mean, we were presenting this in Central America. That was the Project Economic Justice was looking at how this could counter Marxism at the time. And so we're looking at Guatemala, Costa Rica, for example. But we're also looking at places like Ukraine. They're going to have to rebuild. They're going to need a lot of money to do that. And the question is, where are they going to get the money from? And how do they get the money in a way that empowers all the citizens and doesn't just go back to the same kleptocracy that they had? Africa also, wonderful opportunities. We're working with the Biafran liberation group, one of the groups, and they see that what we call the just third way is the way that not only Biafra and Nigeria, but the whole of Africa really needs to move to this form of economic democracy. So the key is finding a leader who can articulate this, having a central bank, having commercial banks ready to be the irrigators of capital and connect people to the private sector growth. But that's a very good question. I mean, we'll be happy if any country leaps forward. Yeah.
Would you like to add to that, Alan?
Yes. No, that's fine.
The amount of the increased capitalization in our country is unbelievable right now. The value adding activities every single day in this country.
Yeah.
So there is an enormous opportunity for redistribution of future wealth here.
Right, without redistributing from the present owners, it's creating new owners through new opportunities.
That's why I said future wealth.
There you go.
Yeah,
future wealth, good.
Jim Hughes.
Yes, thank you very much for the presentations. A couple of questions. Alan, I thought you said that that capital does not include money or financing, but perhaps you meant to say it's not. It does include that. Just anything non-human, right? What Don said is anything non-human.
Yeah. So I think we want to set money apart from capital because money is a tool, but it's not. We're not looking at money just as a commodity, but as a way to part of the financing system. So it's not really a factor of production. I guess that's the easiest way to say it. The tools, the machinery, the land, the raw materials, those are factors. Money is not, in our view.
In your analysis, I thought you said there were two parts, human and non-human is capital. So therefore, where would money fit in those two equations?
Money has the ability to purchase capital.
In classical economics, there's something called the real economy. And the real economy there's no money. It's only factors that go into production and delivering services. And the other half of the system is money, but you can talk about an economy just in terms of factors of production. And I think that's what you're trying to do, right, Alan?
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a very good question. And when I started reading Kelso and trying to understand, that was something that kind of bugged me too. I mean, how are you describing money? What is it? Capital? And Kelso would differentiate that it is a lubricant for the productive process. It is, and he even went as far as to say, it really is a set of symbols. It's not part of the physical reality that we use in order to produce new goods and services. And capital, he also would include patents and things that are not necessarily tangible, but money is really a social tool for enabling new growth for exchanges to take place in the marketplace. It facilitates that. And we would even say that money is anything that can be used to settle a debt. So it's not just currency. I think that's important for people to understand. It's really the thing which brings real things into reality. And even if you consider barter, for example, that in our understanding is an sort of an instantaneous creation of money, because people have to come to this common agreement on when they're exchanging things, value for value. So that is one of those brain twisting questions that you asked. But I think here's one difference is that we would say that money, if you have a well-functioning money system, and here we're talking about banking and central banking, that every human being should have equal access to the money system. What they have to do, though, is find a feasible, productive capital project that could be projected to repay itself. If the loan you get purchases this capital and the capital does what it's supposed to do and creates the goods and services and gets sold and creates the profits, those profits, that stream of profits in the future should be sufficient to pay off the loan. So I know I'm getting into the next our
Right.
next session, but that is a good question. So
Well, let's turn to our last speaker from our last session, Gordon Anderson. I see you have your hand raised.
Okay. No, I'm not muted. On my last session, I talked about the distinction between institutions and sovereign individuals, and that most institutions want to consider themselves sovereign, like the World Economic Forum, the United Nations, that want to run our lives. The government wants to control us. Do you think that capital should be owned by institutions, or should it only be owned by individuals? For example, land. We could have corporations farming lots of land, but if it was owned by a wide number of individuals and the corporations rented that land from those individuals, or if the mineral rights underneath were negotiated with those sovereign individuals who own the land, and then maybe put some limits on land ownership, wouldn't that reverse the situation and remove concentration away from institutions and into the hands of individuals?
Wow, it's a good question too, huh? Well, I think there's a long-term vision, perhaps, and a short-term, moving forward reality to this. So that is a good theoretical question. You still want to just get some projects and some effort to demonstrate through the financing changes that to broaden the ownership. So I don't know about the ownership, but corporations owning, they own productive capital now, they own land. Dawn, bail me out. What do you think?
well, the way we look at institutions is similar to the way we look at money. They are tools. Corporations are tools. Corporations are also owned by human beings. Eventually down the chain, there may be various layers, but ultimately they're owned by human beings. And we would say that ultimately it should be every human being having the opportunity to own in all forms of productive capital. And land that's a very important and special situation because it's finite. Human beings didn't create land, the land. So the question of who should be able to own it is, I think that's an important one in terms of even democracy, because once you have a few landlords or the state is the landlord, that's going to be a very problematic situation in terms of for many different reasons. So we do, among other approaches for how people can own different forms of productive assets, there is an approach, and we can talk about this in the next session. So hopefully that's a hook to get people to come back. But we do have something called the Citizens Land Development Cooperative, which would use this structure to enable every person, every resident within a defined area to become an equal shareholder in this entity, which would be the like a professionally managed land and infrastructure development company. So, now we can easily get into the difference between ownership and management, but we are looking at participation. So that is really the key to this new paradigm. It's not just distribution, it's distribution linked to just opportunities to participate.
Well, perhaps the easiest way to think about what this comes down to is to imagine ESOPs, employee stock ownership programs, that apply throughout the entire economic system.
And that's a good way of doing it. And one of the things that my father and I and a number of our colleagues do is we set up employee stock ownership plans. He was one of the people who got it into the law. But as an example, one of our clients that we had, the employees, 100% of the employees were able to buy out the company using 100% bank loan. So it's 100% leverage. And they were able to buy out the existing owner, who was one of the wealthiest people in Northern Virginia. The repayment was actually faster than scheduled, and the owner got more, the high side of fair market value. But it was because each of these workers were participants in this mechanism that as the company did well and made profits, they did well as owners. So it was able to use the productiveness of a corporation and all the people and tools coming together that allowed them to buy out the company and take over ownership of the company.
Very good. Well, I was in an ESOP program for big part of my career. And at the end of the day, the ESOP shares were worth nothing.
Good. You just brought up a very challenging situation here. And that's, but
ownership is risky.
It is risky. Exactly right. But there are also ways, and we think that what we'll talk about in the next session is a way to spread out the risk that you would be left with nothing. Because if, so we have a way of dealing with risk, and ESOPs, some are better run than others. And some are good companies that for whatever reason go under.
And even ESOPs are very complicated, actually.
They've gotten more complicated than they should be.
Yeah.
And one requirement for a successful ESOP is education. So people have to be educated in, the financing, not just the finance, but the whole operation of the ESOP business. But so their financial literacy has to go up, and that would be required for any successful transformation of our economy with new financing guidelines and opportunities. So you wouldn't have sharks taking advantage of people. That's what we all would like to see anyway.
We have two more hands raised, and then we want to go to to Dr. Ward. So let's invite Robert Sayer to join the conversation. And then after Robert would be Gloria Frothingham.
Okay. This is interesting. So I've been investing in real estate for about 5 or 6 years. And I'm also now on a advisory committee for a big nonprofit that's dealing with housing affordability. So it's a big issue. And I live in an area that's,
pretty diverse. Lehigh Valley, which is about 2 hours west of New York City, about an hour from Philadelphia. It's a fairly prosperous area. Anyway, so the challenges are, one, access to capital really is a key thing, because there are big developers who are doing big things, and they have access to unlimited amount of money, I think, from banks. Anyway, they're doing very well. They're very competent. They're very smart. They do well. And and so the challenge is for the average person is the ability to raise their income. There's the income side of it, and I'm not sure what to do about that. But the housing that's being built is not something that most people can afford. So it's a real challenge, because, part of the equation of real estate is that you want your assets to rise. That's where taxes come from, and it's good for the people who own that property. But getting people into that, and that's one of the things that I'm working on with them and I can't say as I have an answer to it. It's not it's
Right.
it's a complicated problem, but it's helping people to get to get access to that capital, to create capital. And I've been able to do it a little bit myself on a very small level. In other words, get other people's money to buy property, pay them back, and I own the property, essentially. I mean, and it's a simple thing. So, and there's more money than you can imagine available for people that actually have money. That's true. But also the ability to learn how to leverage it. And that's just all I wanted to comment. It's a challenge, and I'm working on housing affordability. I think is a national problem. It's certainly in our area. And I think pretty much everywhere. It's one degree or another. It's a huge issue. So I just wanted to sort of make that comment.
Yeah, you're pointing out the whole issue again of financial literacy is such an important part of of wealth distribution. Because what you're doing requires a lot of financial literacy.
Well, it does. It's simple math, actually. The
Yeah.
math is not hard. Yeah, it's 8th or 9th grade math, but learning how to do that and have the confidence to do it, and knowing the people who will help you, who will be your mentors, is a really key thing. And most people don't have that. I mean,
Okay, let's go on to Gloria.
Yeah.
Gloria Frothingham, and then we'll invite Dr. Ward to close for us. Oh, Gloria, I'm sorry, you're still muted.
I didn't understand a lot, but there were two. I think it was Louis Kelso who spoke about welfare state, and also he said the importance of stock distribution, which I thought was we should buy stock.
Mhm.
My in-laws, they had money for my son to go to college. I think for their other grandchildren to go to college, because they bought stock. The welfare state, maybe there's two different ways of looking at that, but welfare state, I remember this young lady, I was in the women's bathroom and I was listening to her. And she says, oh yeah, I want to have another baby so that I can get more money. So that, that's what when Barack Obama became president, I thought he was going to help the Black people out. He just gave them more money to go on to welfare. So is that did I misunderstand that?
Well, I was talking about the welfare state in terms of, the economic theories that are kind of underwriting large government to take care of people and transfer, income to people because of the lack of our system doing it naturally. So, it's not a bad thing, but what's the future that we want? Okay. Do we want the government to be, the big daddy for everybody? Or do we want some kind of freedom? But yeah, stocks, obviously, if you have money, you can invest and grow, and then you become an owner that way. But to transform the economy where all people can become owners is at the heart of what we're discussing, really. And that's why I went into the theories a little bit. And I know it's tough. Jim, I woke up one morning and I had kind of a almost
Make this quick, Al, because I don't want to cut
All right.
Dr. Ward short.
another sounds good. Another time.
Okay, thank you, Alan. Dr. Ward, you're at home plate. Bring us home.
Yeah, bring us home. Thank you, Dr. Ward.
Oh, you're muted, Dr. Ward. Sorry, you're muted.
Excuse me. Yes, on behalf of Dr. Thomas Walsh, our president, and on behalf of HJI, I really want to thank you for a very stimulating presentation this evening, Mr. Jim Edgerly. And I'd also like to thank our two outstanding speakers, Alan Jessen and Don Brocon. This was a very high-level discussion tonight. And I was very impressed by what was introduced this evening. And I was fortunate enough, I had a chance to mention prior to the program, to meet Mr. Norm Kurland on several occasions because of my dear friend Antonio Betancourt, who had a great deal of interest in this particular area. And I'm glad that on our side, Alan Jessen has kind of picked up the charge and is continuing in this direction, and also really delighted to see the work that Dawn is doing. Dawn, you're an outstanding spokesperson. You really express things so well. So really appreciate that.
Thank you.
I learned a lot tonight. I think the thing that most struck me in tonight's presentation was the binary contribution of human labor. And I'm so glad that you mentioned the intellectual component of human labor this evening, Alan, and also capital input to production versus capital as understood as input to production. I really appreciated that approach to capital as well, that as you expressed it, Alan, very, very helpful for me. There's a lot of things I could say, but I just want to summarize by making a couple of observations about an area where I'm more familiar with, and that relates to the original market economy. And I think about Adam Smith, who, by the way, was a polymath. I mean, if you look at his writings, he wrote on everything. He wrote on law, he wrote on astronomy, he wrote on the origin of languages, he wrote on the process of human development, political economy, morality, and so many other areas. But his most important contribution, I believe, was his first book, which Alan mentioned this evening, which is the theory of moral sentiments. And in that text, he speaks specifically of something inside of a human being that he refers to as the impartial spectator, that somehow guides people to be able to decipher between what is right and what is wrong. And I think, Alan, that ties a lot into your reference to heart, basically. And if you look at Smith's life, he was so much wanting to be able to do the right thing. And when we read An Inquiry into the Wealth of Nations, it's amazing because you really can see that Adam Smith was not out to talk about capitalism. His fundamental preoccupation was the small guy, the people that were being taken advantage of because of the mercantile system that existed in his time. And so I think he had a wonderful intent. But I guess that tonight through the presentation, I really felt this was a very rich discussion. And I think that the contribution of Louis Kelso, the work of Norman Kurland, and also the presentations tonight by Alan and Don, they really evoke perhaps that original ideal that was there in that search of Smith's. By the way, he edited the theory of moral sentiments until the very last day of his life. I'm sorry, the last year of his life. He was constantly focused upon this issue of somehow being guided by conscience. And I think that what you're talking about tonight is really, let's do the right thing. It's clear that the way the economy is working today, it's not the right thing. And it's likewise clear that socialism is not the right thing. So I think you're inviting us to join a very rich conversation. And I thank you for your work. And I thank you, Don, for the work of Justice University and for all that you are doing in this area. We really, really appreciate it. It was a privilege. And I really look forward to your third session. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Beautiful.
Thank you.
Yes, this is a moral issue for our country. This is a moral issue. This is not ultimately economic. This is about virtue in our democratic system. Yeah.
Yes.
Let's give a round of applause for Alan and Dawn, who are pioneering this conversation.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.